conference room fell silent when Richard Matthews cleared his throat. 12 executives around the mahogany table, and every eye was on me. I had just finished presenting our strategy for the Morrison Industries acquisition, 2 years of work, $300 million on the line. He leaned back in his leather chair, that smirk I had grown to despise spreading across his face. "Well, David," he said, letting my name hang in the air like a question mark, "this is certainly thorough, but I'm wondering if someone with your, shall we say, delicate approach is really the right fit to close a deal with Morrison's board. They're old-school Texas oil men. They expect a certain kind of presence. Called delicate would become the very weapon I use to take everything away from them. Growing up gay in corporate America teaches you to speak in code. You learn to measure every gesture, modulate every inflection, edit every story. About your weekend, you become a translator of your own existence, constantly converting your truth into something palatable for boardrooms filled with men who have never had to question whether their voice, their laugh, or their very presence might cost them their career. I spent 15 years perfecting this translation. 15 years watching mediocre straight men climb ladders I had built. While I was told I lacked executive presence or was too collaborative for leadership, the feedback was always wrapped in corporate speak. But the message was clear. You don't fit the prototype of power we're comfortable with. They never said the word gay in performance reviews. They didn't need to. Instead, they talked about my communication style or suggested I needed to be more assertive. They praised my analytical mind while questioning my ability to command respect from clients. Contradiction was exhausting. Be brilliant enough to generate ideas, but invisible enough not to threaten their version of leadership. But here's what they never understood about being underestimated. It gives you time to see everything they think you can't. While they dismissed my delicate approach, I was building relationships they couldn't access, gathering intelligence they couldn't obtain, and positioning myself for moves they couldn't imagine. Corporate world taught me to be small, but they forgot that sometimes the smallest things can bring down the largest structures. They thought calling me delicate was an insult. They had no idea it was about to become their biggest mistake. If you've ever felt like you had to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that weren't built for you, subscribe to this channel. Here, we don't just survive in systems that underestimate us. We reshape them entirely. Your story matters, and voices like ours don't stay quiet anymore. Pemberton and Associates occupied 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of building where your footsteps echo differently depending on which floor you belong to. I belonged to the 32nd floor, high enough to have a view, not high enough to have a corner office. For 8 years, I had been a senior director in mergers and acquisitions, specializing in technology sector deals that consistently outperformed projections. My office was a study in careful curation. The diploma from Wharton hung next to industry awards, but I kept personal photos minimal. A picture of my parents, nothing that would invite uncomfortable questions about my weekend plans or who I lived with. Even my desk accessories were chosen for their neutrality. A silver pen set, a leather portfolio, nothing that could be labeled as too colorful or expressive. The daily navigation required constant recalibration. In morning meetings, I learned to lower my voice when presenting, to lean forward slightly when making points, to avoid gestures that might be read as too animated. When colleagues shared stories about their wives and children, I listened with interest while mentally editing out any mention of Michael, my partner of 6 years. When they invited me to golf outings or poker nights, I declined gracefully, knowing that accepting would mean either lying about my life or risking the subtle shift in dynamics that truth often brought. Sarah Martinez, one of the few other minorities in leadership, understood this dance. We rarely spoke about it directly, but there was recognition in the way she nodded when I mentioned working twice as hard for half the credit. The way she paused before using her natural voice in presentations, just as I did. We were both translators of ourselves daily. The microaggressions came in carefully wrapped packages. When I successfully negotiated a particularly complex acquisition, Richard Matthews would joke that I had charmed the other party rather than acknowledging the months of financial analysis and strategic planning that had actually closed the e-deal. When clients specifically requested to work with me again, it was because I was so good with details, not because I had generated 30% higher returns than any other director in the department. But I was taking notes. Every dismissive comment, every bypassed promotion, every time credit for my work was redistributed to someone with a deeper voice and a firmer handshake. I kept a private record, not for legal purposes, but for strategic ones. I was learning the rules of a game they thought I couldn't play. The turning point began 3 months before the Morrison Industries opportunity surfaced. I was leaving the office late, as usual, when I overheard a conversation between Richard and 2 other senior partners in the elevator bank. They thought they were alone. The Peterson deal was brilliant. One was saying, whoever structured a tax advantage saved us millions. They need to see leadership that looks the part. I looked out our window at the city lights, each one representing someone else trying to find their place in systems that weren't built for them. I'm going to stop playing by their rules, I said, and start writing my own. The total deal value, $2.7 billion. For Pemberton and Associates, landing Morrison as a client would be the largest acquisition in the firm's history. When the preliminary request for proposal arrived, I knew immediately that this was my moment. Morrison wasn't just looking for financial restructuring, they needed complete digital transformation, supply chain optimization, and a delicate navigation of environmental regulations that were reshaping the energy sector. It was exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered challenge that played to my strengths. I spent 6 weeks crafting the initial proposal, working 18-hour days to create a presentation that was both comprehensive and visually stunning. I researched every member of Morrison's board, studied their previous acquisitions, analyzed their public statements about future direction. By the time I submitted the proposal to Richard for review, I had essentially created a roadmap for Morrison's next decade of growth. The response from Morrison's team was immediate and enthusiastic. They wanted to move forward with Pemberton and Associates, and they specifically requested that I lead the engagement. The contract would include a 2% success fee over $50 million if the acquisition completed successfully. That should have been the moment of celebration. Instead, it became the beginning of the most professionally devastating 4 months of my career. The partners' meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I arrived early, my presentation materials organized, my talking points rehearsed. Richard was already there, along with the 3 other senior partners, James Whitfield, Thomas Crawford, and Patricia Henley, the only woman among the senior leadership, though she had a reputation for being tougher on younger employees than any of her male colleagues. David, Richard began before I had even sat down. We've got some concerns about the Morrison engagement. What kind of concerns? Always has been. But this is about perception, David. About what inspires confidence in a room full of oil. Executives who've been doing business the same way for generations, but for client-facing meetings, board presentations, the actual negotiation, we think James should take the lead. Can you be more specific about what concerns you have about my ability to represent the firm to Morrison's board? Prifle, a careful architecture of my professional persona begin to crack. Are you saying that my sexual orientation disqualifies me from leading this engagement? About putting our best foot forward with a conservative client base. More traditionally authoritative, Patricia concluded. I looked around the table one more time, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my entire career. They weren't questioning my competence, they couldn't, because my results spoke. For themselves, they were questioning whether clients would accept me as a leader, and they were using that concern to justify sidelining me from the biggest opportunity of my professional life. I see, I said again. Well, I appreciate your honesty about your concerns. Called. They had just made their biggest mistake. They had shown me exactly what they thought of me, while assuming I would quietly accept their judgment. But I had been taking notes for years, and I had just decided it was time to use them. The next 6 months were a masterclass in professional humiliation, executed with the kind of precision that only comes from institutional experience. They let me keep my title while systematically removing every responsibility that mattered. I became the senior director of background research, essentially a highly paid analyst reporting to James Whitfield, who now carried the title of lead partner on the Morrison engagement. The degradation was methodical. First, they moved me out of my office to a smaller space on the same floor, explaining that James needed the larger space for client meetings. Then they stopped inviting me to senior staff meetings, saying that James would brief me on anything relevant to my work. Compulad. My access to the executive calendar system was downgraded, meaning I could no longer see when important meetings were happening until after they had concluded. But the most painful part was watching James butcher the strategic framework I had spent months developing in client presentations. He would oversimplify complex financial structures, miss critical regulatory considerations, and make promises about timelines that were completely unrealistic. I would sit in the back of the room taking notes, watching Morrison's board members exchange glances that I knew meant trouble. After one particularly disastrous presentation, Morrison's CFO, Elizabeth Torres, approached me during a coffee break. "You're the one who wrote the original proposal, aren't you?" she asked quietly. I glanced around the room, making sure James was out of earshot. "I contributed to the initial analysis. Yes. The regulatory compliance framework alone saved us 6 months of potential delays. But today's presentation, ... double quotes, she paused diplomatically. It seemed like a different team entirely. Companies need advisors who actually understand the business, not just the politics. The final insult came 3 weeks before the Morrison deal was scheduled to close. Richard called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, his expression carefully arranged into what he probably thought was sympathetic concern. "David, I've been thinking about your career development," he began, settling behind his desk like a judge about to render a verdict. "The Morrison engagement has been educational for all of us, and I think it's highlighted some areas where you might benefit from additional training. The firm will cover the cost, of course." It was remedial coursework disguised as professional development. "I appreciate the firm's investment in my development," I said carefully. "When would this training begin?" "James can handle the Morrison closing, and when you complete the program, we'll have some exciting new opportunities to discuss." Sports. I looked across the desk at Richard, this man who had spent years benefiting from my work while questioning my worthiness to present it, who had built his reputation by taking credit for strategies I had developed and then expressing concern about whether I could command respect from clients. "That sounds like an excellent opportunity for growth," I said finally. "I'll need a few days to wrap up my current responsibilities and brief James on the remaining technical details." Elizabeth Torres met me at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park on a Tuesday morning, far from the downtown business district where we might be seen by anyone from Pemberton and Associates. She arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of confident smile that comes from building something from scratch rather than inheriting it. "You look like someone who's made a decision," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I have," I replied, "but I want to make sure I'm making the right one." What they had discovered were significant flaws in Pemberton's approach, regulatory oversights that could delay the closing by months, tax implications that had been completely missed, and integration strategies that would likely result in massive cost overruns. "Morrison's board is getting nervous," Elizabeth explained. "They've invested too much to walk away, but they're starting to question whether Pemberton is the right firm to get them across the finish line. But they need you working for them, not for Pemberton." "What's the timeline?" I asked. Morrison's board meets next Thursday to decide whether to proceed with Pemberton or find new counsel. If we can present them with a viable alternative by then, they'll make the switch. The success fee for Torres Strategic would be 3% instead of Pemberton's 2% over $80 million. Quote, I couldn't simply copy my work from Pemberton. That would be theft of intellectual property and professional suicide. Instead, I had to recreate the entire strategic framework from scratch, using only publicly available information and my own analysis. It meant sleeping 3 hours a night and consuming enough caffeine to power a small city. But by Thursday morning, I had developed a comprehensive acquisition strategy that was better than anything I had ever created while working within Pemberton's constraints. The presentation to Morrison's board lasted for hours. I walked them through every aspect of the acquisition: financial structures, regulatory compliance, integration timelines, risk mitigation strategies, answered questions about tax implications that James hadn't even known existed. I addressed concerns about environmental regulations that Pemberton had dismissed as unimportant. When I finished, the room was quiet for nearly a minute. Finally, Morrison's CEO, Robert Morrison III, leaned forward in his chair. Mr. Chen, this is the level of analysis we expected from the beginning. Where has this been for the past 6 months? Torres Strategic specializes in complex acquisitions that require deep technical expertise. We've been working parallel to Pemberton's team to ensure nothing falls through the cracks. Corson Industries terminated their contract with Pemberton and Associates and signed with Torres Strategic Advisory, effective immediately. On Friday morning, I submitted my resignation to Richard Matthews via email, effective immediately by 10 a.m. Elizabeth had issued a press release announcing Torres Strategic's engagement with Morrison Industries for strategic consulting services related to their landmark acquisition. First Richard, then James, then Patricia. I let every call go to voicemail. The final call came from Thomas Crawford at 4:30 p.m. I answered this one. David, his voice was carefully controlled. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We should talk about this in person. Your work on Morrison was done as a Pemberton employee. You have fiduciary obligations, confidentiality agreement. Connorist and has the expertise they needed. Torres Strategic has a transformational new client. And Pemberton has learned something important about the value of executive presence. I thought about the question seriously. How did it feel to walk away from 15 years of careful career building? How did it feel to bet everything on my ability to succeed outside the system that had shaped me? It feels like I finally stopped translating myself, I said. 6 months later, Torres Strategic Advisory completed the Morrison Industries acquisition 3 weeks ahead of schedule and 15% under budget. The success generated enough attention to land us for additional clients in the first quarter, including 2 Fortune 500 companies that had specifically requested to work with the team that had revolutionized the Morrison deal. Interesting phone call this morning, she said, settling into the chair across from me. Pemberton and Associates, apparently they're having some challenges with client retention. AIT, he seemed particularly interested in having you involved in any future collaboration. What did you tell him? AI. It was the sound of people who had learned to stop fighting systems that were never built for them and had started building their own instead. Later that evening, I was walking through downtown Chicago when I passed the Pemberton building. Through the windows, I could see the warm glow of lights on the 32nd floor, where someone else was probably working late, probably questioning whether they belonged in rooms that made them feel small. I pulled out my phone and opened LinkedIn, typing a post I had been thinking about for months. Conjure World needs leaders who think differently, not leaders who think the same. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their differences are their strengths, not their limitations. And in the comments, tell me about a time when you stopped trying to fit in and started building your own path. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And the tables we build together will always have room for everyone who's been told they don't belong at someone else's. Remember, they called you delicate because they were afraid of your strength. Now show them what delicate can do.